Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again for another live edition of Everything Compliance. Today we have the full gang of Jonathan Marks, Karen Woody, Karen Moore, Jonathan Armstrong, and Matt Kelly. So we're going to go west to east today, and that's going to be very hard because the west is not very far west. But we're going to start with the professor, Karen Woody. Then we're going to go to Karen Moore. Then we're going to go to Mr. Marks, then Mr. Armstrong, and we're going to conclude with Matt Kelly today. So, Karen Woody, lots going on. What do you have to share with us today?
Lots going on. It's good to be back. I hope you can hear me. I have some sort of cold, so I sound a little like Kathleen Turner this morning. But for those of you who are young and listening to this, Kathleen Turner was a famous actress with a low voice. So I realize that might not land with people who are listening to this. All right, so I'm going to talk about the SEC today and a little bit about President Trump because President Trump tweeted on Monday that he would like to change the reporting schedule for publicly traded companies from quarterly reporting, which is what we have now, to semi-annual. So effectively eliminating two of the reports. So right now companies file 3 quarterly reports and then 1 yearly report. And that's what they file with the SEC. And the president, via tweet, suggested on his Truth Social that should change. And I think I'm going to spend a couple minutes today walking through what that might look like or what that might mean. So I guess the gist is that, again, he thinks this is a burden for public companies to have to go through all of these hoops and regulations demanded by the SEC in order to provide a lot of disclosure and information to the markets. And I will say that this isn't entirely new, this push to shift the reporting requirements, nor is, of course, the drumbeat that it's really hard to be a public company. We see this sometimes when it's the burdens of what it takes to IPO, the regulations on public companies. It's all too much. So we should dial this all back. I will say that the reporting requirements as they are in existence today have been that way since 1970, but not since the origin of the securities laws or the SEC in the 30s. So, 50 years, 55-ish going on of doing it this way, but that's not to say they've always been done that way. And there's been, at various eras, some discussion of whether that should shift or not. So it isn't an entirely novel or new, suggestion to change these. And indeed, in Trump 1, in 2018, there was also some request by the SEC then to take public comment on possibly changing this periodic recording. That didn't end up getting off the ground, but it seems now that Commissioner Atkins and the SEC is much more on board to considering it this time around. So there's been a statement even from the SEC saying they will certainly try to prioritize this and what President Trump is calling for. Again, with this idea that this will eliminate the regulatory burdens that companies face when they access our capital markets. So why now and why this? I think the idea here is that I have a couple thoughts about it, which is, one is practical and maybe one is theoretical. I will say there are, of course, some big proponents of this change, notably people like the Chamber of Commerce or Business Roundtable, who again say, let's push to, deregulate, like less regulatory state. And their theory is also that this quarterly report results in short-termism, meaning like this idea that companies only are motivated to make sure they're at the quarterly report, they can produce these great results every quarter, and that hurts the economy or hurts companies because they can't focus on long-term goals because they have this sort of constant requirements every 90 days to, say something to the SEC. So short-termism, sure, we've heard that a lot. As I said, I think in response, I have a practical comment and then a theoretical comment. And the practical comment is this, is like, practically, I don't know if this would change anything because I spoke with some in-house counsel and sort of floated this, like, would this really change your life at all? This make life so much easier to not get ready for the queue. And they're like, no, because we're already ramping all this up for other reporting, to earnings calls, to other investor groups, whatever, that we sort of are duplicating that work by also then sending something to the SEC. So there's already I would say, industry norms around reporting and giving information out. That is what the work is. And so shifting that away from, you also don't file this report with the SEC, might not in practice have any actual effect. So that's sort of the practical idea. Like, sure, there's this idea that we still have to get ramped up and have a certain significant normative disclosure requirements in house. But the other sort of thought I have in my other sort of lens here is more of the, I would say, theoretical, but almost sort of what I would say maybe over academically, the expressive point of this. Like, what was the point of messaging this? And I think that's the bigger point here because, I think, our securities markets are really still, I think, the envy of the world. And some of the reason is because of this, we are premised upon disclosure and the idea that investors have access to this information. Sure, there are other countries, certainly some in the EU, that have a slower slower pace of disclosure than we do. And that was some of Trump's argument for why we should come more in line with countries that don't require this much disclosure. So I do think that the outcome of that, of shifting, is sending a message that, again, we're sort of pro deregulation, pro company, at the expense of investors, and honestly, maybe even at the expense of market stability and transparency. And so I think that's sort of the issue. And I think it dovetails with the theme we're seeing certainly this week from the SEC, which, again, just this week, maybe just 2 days ago, the SEC is now allowing for there to be mandatory arbitration clause in corporate charters and bylaws for companies that IPO, which they used to not allow. So that, again, maybe is a niche, seems like a one-off thing, but the practical effect of that will be a significant reduction in securities class actions and forcing claims into private arbitration. So what that means is the effect is that we're going to quash transparency. We're going to quash sort of any public forum of seeing what companies are up to. Couple that with, fewer times that they have mandatory disclosure. Then I think, we start to see more market shenanigans, like maybe some more volatility, certainly maybe some insider trading. So, I guess I'm sort of on the fence, like, yeah, if we went to semi-annual reporting, would there be this absolute, groundswell shift in the markets? Probably not. But again, it's because of just usually there's a significant amount of investors requiring or asking for this. But as we sort of start to strip power from investors in other ways, I don't know. I do think the takeaway from this is the expressive point, the messaging of the president can change a 55-year-old precedent through a tweet, which, that's the sort of powerful sort of, look, I guess we would say. And that I think the message is also that the SEC, yet again, is falling on the side certainly of the president, but also of a deregulatory stance, a pro-company stance, maybe at the expense of investors. So that's my sort of, again, quick 5 minutes on what might seem like a little small administrative shift, but and we'll see actually how outsized that is or not. But that's my sort of summary of that. Are there some thoughts or questions by this group?
Yes, I will start taking the opposite, and I will join in Ms. Moore as the only other two people in here who I think have worked for U.S. public corporations. But I completely agree that short-termism is a thing, and that I wanted to have to do that less. When I was in the corporate world, our entire structure was based on I was in the legal department, but having contracts closed by the end of the quarter. And that's really all we cared about because that's all the street cared about. So I think there is something there. I know there's other people, including yourself, that have different views, particularly around transparency and the reporting. But I think short-termism is a thing. I mean, it was Halliburton, and we focus on that all the time. But I just saw us drive what's going to happen in the next quarter. Do we need to move it to the quarter after that and play financial games that I didn't think were really of the long term benefit of the company? But I know others have different views. So Matt, give us your view.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how much baloney exists on the planet because that is still not going to be enough to measure up to the supposed rationale for doing this. There is no reason whatsoever to do this, but let me go through a couple of points. Number one, why is Trump doing this now? Why not 6 months ago? Why not 6 months in the future? He's doing this now because he knows that in about 4 weeks, when companies start filing their Q3 earnings, they're going to be terrible. And he is trying to say that because of burdens and regulations and everything else, these bad earnings that are going to start showing up, and rest assured they will, he's going to say they don't really count. That what really counts is going to be like in 6 months or 18 months or 2 weeks, his famous time period. The same way that he just said with the horrendous job numbers a couple of weeks ago that job losses today don't really count against him. You have to judge him on, I guess, great job numbers that'll come next year. It's always going to be something like that. The political animus for doing this right now is to cover his rear end when companies start saying tariffs are for real, job losses are for real, and we don't have good earnings. And he's going to magically say, because of regulation, these bad earnings that he is driving in his erratic policies, that doesn't count. Second, number two, okay, the law maybe allows that the SEC could diminish or cut back quarterly reports because it created them only in 1970. Let's remember that before then, most people, their retirement savings was based on pensions that they would be getting from corporations or from Social Security. Today, most people, your retirement savings depend on your 401k, which depends on the market and good, deep, vibrant capital markets, which this will try to suffocate. To what degree? We don't know. I think if they did adopt semi-annual reports, a lot of companies would publish earnings releases anyways. But we need quarterly reports now because the entire ecosystem of society's retirement services depends on good, strong, vibrant markets that report earnings quarterly. It is baloney that the compliance costs are really getting worse and worse. They are not. They're getting better and better all the time. It's not like companies can't close the books every quarter. They are closing them every month internally. They know exactly how much money they have. And lastly, the idea that because of our regulatory system, we are strangling IPOs, that is also just not accurate, right? IPOs have been on decline around the world for many years. Most of the big IPO decline in the United States only happened between 96 and 2002, thanks to Enron and the great deflating of the dot-com bubble. But actually, IPOs, they blinked back up during the pandemic because all of these SPACs came along and were taking companies public. By the way, nobody has noticed lately, but SPACs are coming back this summer. So the IPO market is doing very well right now. Why, therefore, do we need to get rid of this? There's nothing about this that is necessary other than Donald Trump catering to a couple of rich people who don't like compliance burdens and him trying to cover his rear end. My last point, I guess maybe would be a question back to Karen Woody. The policy to say that now companies can prevent shareholder lawsuits in their bylaws and just go directly to mandatory arbitration. Are we sure that that's going to stick? Because when I read Carolyn Crenshaw's statement about it, she's the Democratic SEC commissioner, she point blank said in her statement, do we really have the legal authority to do this? And she also said something about the economic analysis of that being deeply flawed. It read to me like a giant clarion call to lawyers saying, please sue us and tie this up in court because we can't do this.
Yeah, no, it's valid. I mean, it's outlawed in Delaware. Delaware just changed that to saying you can't put that. I actually think there's on a more nuanced discussion, I think it's providing a more sort of lighter fluid to the maybe Dexit movements of like, well, let's find a forum that will allow this. Like Delaware doesn't allow this. And, there's some sense that this might challenge the very, facile, adept Delaware legislature to rethink that after they said, oh, wait, hold on. Now the SEC commissioner is sort of making a comment that, this is going to, I think there will be some fallout from this, but you're right. Like Delaware says you cannot have these clauses in your chart, and that's where people are incorporated. So yeah, it's a good point that like, where can we, do they have the legal capability to comment on what can be in bylaws? That's why it was, I think, couched in when you send us these things to IPO on our markets, like now you're in our lane, and that's what we're commenting to. But yeah, at the end of the day, it goes to really a state and corporation issue.
Karen Moore.
Yeah, just on that last point, I was just reading this morning, and I confess I skimmed it, so I don't have a lot of the details. But I think Tom, in your neck of the woods, Texas is looking to change its corporations law to prevent shareholders that hold less than $1 million or 3% of the outstanding shares from floating any questions. So they're completely, voiceless. So I think that part of that Dexit is a move to forum shop for places like that that'll be a little bit more friendly and reduce the burden on the company. On the short-termism, I'm not going to comment so much on the move from quarterly to semi-annually, so much as one of my soapboxes, which is that there's such a short-termism in terms of the comp and ben of executive leadership that we very rarely now see large corporations having any kind of opportunity for longer-term strategic planning, because the results are the results and the compensation and the benefits are the comp and ben. And I really think that there needs to be a move away from that, especially in kind of tough economies or shifting landscapes where you want a company's sustainability as a business to not be too drastically affected. And Tom, I liked your compliance officers on board blog that came out. At least again, I saw that this morning. Getting compliance people onto boards, not just in audit committees, but in comp and ben and risk committees as well.
All right, Mr. Marks.
Yes, sir.
What do you have for us today?
Oh, well, let's talk about maybe fraud risk assessments and compliance risk assessments. Seems to
How
be
about?
Yeah, let's do that. So, kind of there seems to be some, I'll call it market confusion out there, but at first glance, they probably seem to be pretty similar. Both deal with risk, controls, and governance, but the truth is that they truly are pretty different. And I get into this debate with people all the time. Tom, and you and I were talking about this before. But they're different in purpose. They're definitely different in methodology, and they're certainly they're different in impact. They do complement one another in some way, but from my perspective, the compliance risk assessment helps you answer the question: are we following the laws, regulations, and internal policies we're required to follow? And a fraud risk assessment goes a little bit deeper, and it asks, could someone intentionally break those rules, deceive others, and harm the organization? And would we even detect it in time? So, that's when I'm talking to people, that's kind of how I lay it out. And the difference to me is critical, because compliance without fraud detection is like, it's kind of like locking your front door of your house while leaving the back door wide open. So, and again, I just think that there's some confusion there. But let's go back to the whole purpose of all this, and the fraud risk assessment piece of this. It's really a structured process that is designed to identify, assess, and prioritize, fraud acts or fraud schemes that could harm the organization. But unfortunately, like I mentioned, many organizations even get this wrong. They treat fraud literally like another line item in a compliance checklist, focusing really only on controls or financial reporting. That approach really misses the most important element, and that's the mindset of the fraudster, or as I like to say, the mind behind the crime. So a strong fraud, for those that are listening out there, I'm going to give you some guidance, but a strong fraud risk assessment begins with starting with the act itself, like I mentioned. So the act is really the fraud scheme. So you identify the key fraud schemes that could occur in your organization. For instance, false vendor setups, revenue inflation, insider collusion, or improper use of restricted funds. These are the how behind the fraud. Then there's the concealment. I'll get back to this in a second, but that's really how it's hidden. So fraud is rarely overt, right? For a lot of reasons, and those that are just brazen enough to let it out there, I mean, they have their own problems. But perpetrators, at least deliberately, initially, also try to hide their actions. So they might manipulate data, falsify documents, book bogus journal entries, override controls, or even exploit process weaknesses that that are really that actually bury the evidence of the wrongdoing. And then there's the conversion. So why would you do this? Usually for personal gain. I can't explain why some people actually do this, even though their personal gain is meaningless. But it's really how that scheme is converted into a bet to the benefit of the bad actor. And whether it's cash, inflated bonuses, promotions, reputational enhancement, there's always a payoff that motivates the deception, at least from my experience. And from there, we map how these schemes interact with critical business processes and identify gatekeepers. And I'll get back to that in a second. But those are really the individuals that have the authority to approve or review transactions. And this is really a critical step in this process. There are points of control where fraud can either be stopped or they could slip through undetected. So, and a lot has to do with skills and capabilities, which I'm not going to talk about today. So let's talk about some red flags for a second, because I think the next step in this is really red flags. So in this stage of the fraud risk assessment, it's critical to evaluate those red flags. And those are early warning signs of potentially something that's not right. Doesn't necessarily mean that there's fraud, but they're just warning signs. And I break them out into 4 distinct categories: data, documents, lack of controls, and behavior. I'm not going to get into all the minutiae behind them. You can read those online for yourself at some point. I believe I've written about this maybe 100 times. But just for example, like data red flags, transactions that have unusual times, transactions that are unusual or frequent or rare in occurrence. Then we have document red flags, missing or altered documents. For example, approving expense reports without receipts, lack of controls or red flags, so inadequate segregation of duties and the like. And then there's behavioral red flags, employees living behind their means. You've heard all these before. Employees facing personal stressors. That doesn't happen today at all, right? Yeah, who are we kidding ourselves? So connecting the red flags to controls is really the next process. And once the red flags are identified, we evaluate whether the controls are truly built to actually detect and deter, that particular behavior. And many organizations rely on controls designed for compliance, which are great for catching unintentional errors, but fraud is intentional. So, and this is the problem we've been facing all along, is people get confused about control design. Number one, they don't even know what an internal control means. Matt Kelly can tell you all about that. But more importantly, they don't even understand what it actually can or should be doing. So, but, you can't view this in a vacuum. So the questions that I always say to people, is this risk one organizations are willing to accept if we identify something? If not, how might we mitigate or transfer that particular risk? And who owns the responsibility for managing it? So, like I said, this really doesn't happen in a vacuum. And fraud really thrives where oversight is weak, rationalizations are generally strong, and culture turns a blind eye or just doesn't exist at all. So when executed properly, the fraud risk assessment produces more than just a report. It provides really a strategic roadmap for fraud. I don't like to use the word prevention. I like the word deterrence because whatever, but I'll say prevention here. But it does provide a strategic roadmap for fraud prevention, early detection, and it actually enhances and helps organizational resilience. So what about a compliance risk assessment? Well, a compliance risk assessment, while related, serves a completely different purpose. It's about ensuring that organizations are meeting their legal, regulatory, and policy obligations. So what that typically involves is obviously identifying those applicable obligations, assessing exposure, and then evaluating processes and controls, and then prioritizing corrective actions. So regulations like the Department of Justice often focus on these 3 questions, right? Is your program well designed? We haven't heard these before. Is it implemented in good faith, and does it work in practice? and I like to think of it this way: compliance risk assessments confirm you're coloring inside the lines. Fraud risk assessments force you to think like someone intentionally coloring outside the lines and trying to get away with it. So I think that's a different way of thinking of it, but I think it's pretty simple. But the biggest mistake organizations make is assuming that the compliance risk assessment automatically covers the fraud risk assessment. And I'm telling you right now, it absolutely doesn't. And the key differences are there, or the key differentiators are focus on intent versus process. Compliance asks, are we following the rules? Fraud asks, could someone deliberately subvert those rules to benefit themselves? Again, going back to that, the three things that I mentioned before, the three elements. The scope of the risk: compliant focuses narrowly on regulatory exposure. In most cases, fraud looks broadly at financial, operational, reputational threats, including internal and external bad actors. There is some crossover, yes, but I'm going over these fundamentally. From a methodology perspective, compliance relies heavily on surveys and documentation. Fraud leverages forensic tools like interviews, analytics, and behavioral red flag mapping. Compliance does use some of those same things, but I think it's more on the fraud side than it is the compliance side. And from an outcome perspective, compliance produces policies and certifications, and fraud creates actionable real-time detection and prevention strategies. Like I said, they do complement one another. So taking it beyond to a one-dimensional process, if you're truly utilizing your fraud risk assessment, those red flags that I talked about, data, documents, lack of controls, and behavior, those should be embedded in your training. That's what people should be learning on. If you walk into an FCPA seminar and someone says the FCPA was enacted in the 1970s, you should immediately leave. But if they start talking about what the red flags are and they start talking about data, documents, lack of controls, and behavior, and they get into all the particulars, then I think you're probably going to learn something. And I think by doing this, you transform this static risk assessment into something that's multidimensional. It's multidimensional, and it builds awareness, and it builds detection, and it builds that fundamental concept that we like to call continuous improvement. So I'm going to wrap it up. I promise. I know I have diarrhea in the mouth today, but the compliance risk assessment ensures your organization is following the rules, and a fraud risk assessment protects you from those who would deliberately break them. So just remember that this really isn't a project. I like to say it's not a set it and forget it exercise. It's a living and breathing process that will strengthen your organization over time. But, I guess just in closing out my segment, bringing it all back together, compliance really keeps you lawful, and fraud risk management keeps you safe.
Any questions or comments for Mr. Marks? Well, I have one.
Sure.
Jonathan, do you need, you're talking about the difference in the focus in a compliance risk assessment and a fraud risk assessment. What about the person who does the risk assessment? Should you have a fraud risk examiner, a certified fraud risk examiner, a forensic accountant, or someone with that specialization, or not?
Well, I'll flip the script on you. If you're going to do a compliance risk assessment, should you have someone who's a lawyer or who specializes in compliance and has the skills, knowledge, and experience to do the compliance risk assessment? I think the answer to your question is absolutely. But not, look, the certifications are lovely. They truly are. I get a ton of them. I would throw them all in the freaking trash, to be honest with you. I think, the real meat and potatoes here is the fact that I've been there. I've done that. I've been in the trenches. I've skinned my knees. I've broken my nose. I've got poked in the eye and kicked all over my body. So I kind of understand, what's going on. And for those people that are doing these things, they have to have those experiences. Otherwise, you won't understand, a red flag from a yellow flag or a red flag from a blue flag. So, I'm a firm believer in the folks that are doing this stuff, should have that skills, knowledge, and experience. That's the standard that I would set for anybody. So, if you're a lawyer and you have experience in compliance and you've built compliance programs, and you've tested those compliance programs and you've been involved in assessing risk across the organization, I'm sure you're qualified to do a compliance risk assessment. But on the same token, that same individual, if they don't have any idea what fraud risk is or how to design an internal control, stay in your own lane, please. And you bring up a bigger point. So now you're going to get me on my soapbox is, everyone's hiring for compliance professionals and they want them to be lawyers. That's wonderful. But I think that's just one piece. So I'm forced to understand the law from what I do. I'm not, I would never say that I'm an expert in anything because I'm not. But, you know, I understand what needs to be done and probably better than most. And I'm not a lawyer. So we could debate that later.
Whew. All right.
I told you I had diarrhea of the mouth today. I'm sorry.
I'm going to go get some cold water.
And by the
and
way,
throw it
if we're going to debate it, I do have popcorn.
Oh, hey, that's great. I got some pre and probiotics. So we're cheers.
Wow. A new level. Karen Moore, you want to take us back to a little sanity?
Yeah, and something a little bit less fraught, although a lot less organized, Jonathan. That was amazing. I wish I'd been taking notes, but you were talking too fast. So I'm going to start with a goedemorgen, bonjour, dobro utro, because I would like to talk about accent bias, which is kind of a bias that slipped right past me. I don't know, Karen, Woody, you're full-time, but as a part-time academic, I get all sorts of interesting things that come across my email. And one thing that caught my attention the other day was from the International Journal of Selection and Assessment of all things, which published a January 2025 study called The Meta-Analysis of Accent Bias in Employee Interviews, the Effects of Gender and Accent Stereotypes, Interview Modality, and Other Moderating Features. And I thought, wow, this is, so I did. I confess I skipped through a lot of the math that was in the middle, but still, there's some very interesting conclusions from this study that I do think are relevant for us compliance officers looking at our population. So what they looked at were employment interviews. And to cut a very long story short, what they found in this study was that the evaluations were consistently biased against non-standard accent applicants. And that bias was even higher when the applicant was a woman. And really interestingly, it was even more biased when it was a female doing the assessment of a female applicant. Just to allay Tom's concerns about his Texas accent, there was no significant difference in the bias, whether it was an accent on racial lines, regional lines, or foreign lines. So it's both national and international, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, if you even make it through the bias that is, you know, reportedly or actually proven by studies built into large language models in the AI review of your resume, if you've got an accent, you may also encounter further bias just in the interview process. So that kind of bar to getting a job is twofold. Now, interestingly, you know, of course, if we think about it, research also shows that while we unconsciously group people and bring in our own stereotypes based on accent, that grouping and that stereotype can be both positive and it can be negative. So despite this study, which shows a kind of a negative bar or entry point for people with non-standard accents, there are cases where an accent can have a positive bias as well. If we think about things like in the United States for a very long time, and maybe continuing today, the Midwest accent was considered kind of the generic accent for news readers. It was considered the one that carried the least emotional or judgmental load to it. And if we move over to your neck of the woods, Jonathan, for a long time, the UK had BBC had a stated policy of using newscasters, newsreaders that had received pronunciation. They, interestingly, have recently moved consciously away from that to the point where some newsreaders are saying that they're actually detrimentally treated because of their received pronunciation. They want to have a broader representation of different accents to represent the diversity of accents within such a small island with so many different accents. But I looked at a ton of other studies and surveys and polls that showed a whole bunch of attitudes towards accents in the UK. Call centers tend to be located in Scotland because the Scottish accent is considered warm, friendly, and financially prudent, let's say, financially prudent. Liverpudlians come out the worst. Their accent is least trustworthy and even criminally oriented, while the Devon accent, Jonathan, is rated highest alongside received pronunciation, although the Glaswegian accent also came out pretty well there too. So we've got this kind of accent bias one way or the other that maybe isn't really reaching our consciousness as we're looking at various unconscious biases in the treatment of employees. It's something maybe to add to a relatively long list. Interestingly, linguistic characteristics such as accents are protected. They're part of the protected class under Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But when I tried to look into whether there have been any cases brought on the basis of accent, I didn't really find anything specific to accent. There were things on language, English only environments, etc. But I didn't see anything on accents. I'd be interested to see that. The UK Equality and Human Rights Commission similarly protects those. But the fact that that accent bias can carry all the way through somebody's career development, I think is something that bears looking into, maybe a little bit of training on that just for awareness, but also some data analytics. I know I've worked for 4 different multinational companies, and the kind of access into executive leadership for people with accents, I don't have any scientific study. It's just a kind of gut reaction. I do think that there's a bit of barrier to entry there. Of course, that rabbit hole led me into a couple of other rabbit holes I'll touch on really quickly because they're also interesting. I love languages. Psychology Today put out a whole series studying a very wide-ranging set of studies that say that there's actually personality changes when you're speaking in a foreign language, which is interesting to me because when I was working in a largely French-speaking environment, one of my colleagues said that that when I spoke French, it was very cute, which is just not an attribute I would normally ascribe to myself. Nothing wrong with cute, but I don't think of myself as a cute person, but apparently kind of my whole demeanor and expression changed when I attempted to speak French. And now I see that this is backed up by studies. You do this kind of cultural frame switching when you associate the language with the culture around it. I think you're also kind of, struggling to put together a reasonable sentence. But when I started thinking about language structure, I thought, the structure of the language affects the way you think as well. Russian has 6 case endings, which means that not only do you have to try and sort them all out when you're speaking, but it means you can be very precise about the meaning of a word in a sentence in a way that you can't in other places. German has very strict word order, and in complex sentences, a lot of times the verb comes all the way at the end. And so you've got to really be waiting in anticipation of what the action actually is relevant to the sentence. Japanese has a whole different linguistic pattern for women. The way women speak is different than the way men speak, which must affect the way you research things. And then just back to German, they've got that very, bad habit, I think, of creating very, very long compound words. And I think a while back when I was talking about the German supply chain due diligence law, the LKSG, I attempted to spell out the whole entire word and failed miserably because it's about 120 syllables. So I think that there are a lot of examples where speaking in a foreign language can change your demeanor. And that's kind of interesting for, again, multinational corporations that are attempting a single language for the operations of the company. Think about, well, what personality are you dealing with when you're talking about a non-native English speaker? What is their personality like in their native language? And then the last study that I saw that I thought was really interesting, I read a while back and kind of resurfaced, was that people who are speaking in their non-native language have a very difficult time lying. They tend to be more truthful because of the cognitive load of speaking a foreign language and then also trying to sort out all of the things you need to sort out when you are telling a lie. And I thought, that could have some really interesting implications in investigations interviews, for example. So I think that study could be really useful. And I will just mention one other. It's not really a study. It's a whole kind of approach and body of research, people working in kind of multinational environments. I find really useful to use, which is Kurt Hofstadter's Cultural Dimensions, that kind of sorts out different countries by power dynamics and other dimensions, which also have an effect on the way people approach problem solving. So that is my kind of like interesting foray over the last few days into what started with accent bias and kind of went into use of language in the workplace. So dankjewel, spasiba, merci, and that's me for today.
I've got a comment, and to break the veil a bit, my chat isn't working, Tom. I think I've been discriminated against once on the basis of my accent from a large US law firm, where the and they headhunted me, and the feedback from the recruiter was his client base wasn't credible when set against his accent. And believe it or not, the person who made the comment was from my hometown. And I thought that very, very strange. But at the same time, I think I guess most people do. I think I default to a broader hometown accent when I'm angry. And I did have an episode recently where somebody said to me something like they weren't sure I wanted the fight because I was very pleasant and amiable. And I think in stress, I defaulted to my hometown accent, which made them change their mind. I think I sound like a sort of a northern villain that you might get, Mark Strong, that type of accent for those fans of US drama, which I know there's at least one here. But I do think that whole thing about language is really fascinating in investigations. Just to give you one example, we did an investigation around some voting of a subsidiary of a US corporation that made something really specialist and technical. And effectively in that board subsidiary, two of the native, the people local to the plant had voted in favor of something that was a very bad thing. And it all boiled down to language. People had presumed that because their technical English was very good for the thing that the business did, they'd assumed that their corporate governance English was as good as their technical product English, which was just the wrong assumption. So when these people had said yes to something, had it been explained to them, they would have said no, and bad things happened as a result. So I think as well as the whole accent thing, there's a whole other rabbit hole on, if you're a US corporation particularly, don't assume that because somebody converses well with you, they always understand what you're talking about.
Matt?
I just want to echo Karen's point that when people speak a second language, their personality changes. Because I have noticed that when my wife, who is Latina, switches to speaking Spanish to me, generally she's way more angry. I'm not entirely sure what that means because, of course, I don't speak Spanish. And I'm sure that when she hears this little quip on the podcast later on, she'll start speaking Spanish to me then.
And I will just end with 45 years ago when I moved to Michigan to go to graduate school. The first time I said y'all, I was laughed out of a bar. This spring, so I adopted the universal phrase, you guys. This spring, I was informed, Tom, this is a group of men and women. You cannot say you guys. You have to say y'all, proving once again that the South really did win the war of Northern aggression. With that, Matt, what do you got for us today?
Oh, I wanted to talk a bit about the challenges of employees getting doxxed. And yes, this comes about because of the Charlie Kirk assassination last week. And what has happened since then really demonstrates, I think, some of the new challenges that compliance and HR teams face with internal investigations these days. The rough pattern, whether it's about the Charlie Kirk assassination or something else, the rough pattern is this: big thing happens. Polarized political invective then floods the internet, which may or may not be true, and it may or may not be coming from people or fake accounts, bot accounts, all this stuff. But online activists then start tracking all of that content online and match those statements to the personal data of actual people whom the activists believe are behind these online statements. Then the activists flood those actual people with voicemails or texts or emails, and they're threatening all sorts of violence or visits to your house or photos of your house that get texted to you or stuff like that. Very creepy and unsettling. Also, the online activists target the employers of these people, saying, look at these social media posts from this person whom I have identified, and apparently they work at your place. What are you doing, company? Why are you employing this terrible person? They should be fired. And we have this mix of potentially real or maybe not real, or we'll never know information with actual people going to actual companies, and the social media pressure gets turned up to 11. What are you supposed to do there? Now, that's just the general thing. I'm going to give a very specific example related to the Charlie Kirk assassination, where there was a guy, and he's been written about now. His name is Ali Nasrati, and he is an IT worker at Walmart. And somebody out there somewhere took Mr. Nasrati's photo and his name and used it to create a social media account that then attacked Charlie Kirk and said all sorts of nasty things about good riddance to this racist, and I'm glad he's dead, and all this other stuff. Very inflammatory. An online activist by the name of Bad Hombre. Who is this person? We don't know. Is he a human? Is he a Russian bot? Is he a Chinese bot? Is he something else? We don't know. But Bad Hombre took those statements from that alleged account of Mr. Nasrati and matched it to the personal data of the actual Mr. Nasrati, and then tweeted out to Bad Hombre's 182,000 followers, this is Mr. Nasrati. He's terrible. He hated Charlie Kirk. He works at Walmart. Here is Walmart's corporate office. Why don't you, followers, call up Walmart and demand that Mr. Nasrati be fired? Now, Mr. Nasrati never actually said anything about Charlie Kirk, not in favor of his statements, not against his statements, not in favor of his death or anything. Mr. Nasrati, the real one, has a social media account that has never said anything about any politics at all. Apparently, the guy's just a soccer fan, and that's the only thing he ever tweets about. But here he is getting death threats. Here is Walmart getting all of these demands that he be fired. Walmart had suspended him with pay pending an investigation. I don't know yet what has happened to that, but he is not the only example of people who get caught up in this, whatever it is. And I've been thinking about this. So I am going to try to coin a new term for the compliance profession. I think that these could be called synthetic allegations, because they are about real people, but it involves statements that might not necessarily be true or might not ever be able to be proven true or false. But if you take these online statements that exist, where did they come from? We don't know. And somebody out there who, we don't know, matches them to a real person with real personal data and then doxes them to thousands or millions of followers and demands that they suffer grave consequences. Number one, what about their physical safety and the danger they're in? But number two, their employers get swept up in this and they're under a social media microscope. What's the compliance function supposed to do there? Like, in theory, you could have somebody with a synthetic allegation against them. A lot of these allegations look terrible, but they might have a parallel set of other social media profiles that look perfectly fine and perfectly nice. How do you know which one is true and which one is false? Maybe they're both true. How much money are you going to invest in a digital forensic investigation of this? If you reach the wrong conclusion, you could have a wrongful retaliation lawsuit against you. If you take no action because you think that's correct, you don't believe the false statements, you do believe these other social media accounts that seem nice and harmless are the real ones. If you reach that conclusion and tell the online activists to go pound sand, they're going to accuse you of being part of the great, I don't know, anti-Kirk conspiracy theory or Antifa or whatever. What about your ethical priorities that, do you not believe in a fair and equal treatment of an employee? How are you going to give them that under these high pressure, probably condensed timelines to do an investigation? This is going to be a mess. And I don't have a good answer for everybody. I just simply point out that the Charlie Kirk assassination and all of these online doxings that have happened since then, they just really crystallized the challenge here that compliance and investigation teams will really need to think about, how do we want to investigate this? What do we do with data that can never be proven or disproven? And now most social media data, like, it can't be. Who really owns that account? Who knows? An employee might have a dozen different accounts, some of them harmless, some of them terrible. Or maybe there are a dozen different accounts about this person, but only one is real. Are you going to do an investigation for every single allegation you get? This is a gigantic mess, and we are going to have to think about it, because inevitably it's one of these things where the company probably has a no-win scenario, but this is coming to you soon if it hasn't hit you already.
And I would just pick up on Matt's point that I think this is precisely in the purview of the compliance officer, the chief compliance officer. We are the holders of institutional justice and institutional fairness in a corporation, as set out by the Department of Justice. So you better start thinking about this, and you better have a policy, or at least an idea of what you're going to do when this starts happening. So well done, Matt, and I hope you keep thinking about it.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Armstrong, visiting us from the United States today. What do you have in a Nashville accent for us?
Yeah, well, thank you all. I am in Nashville. I've been to the SCCE conference. Nice to see Karen and Matt there as well. But I'm going to talk about a case that I've been dealing with back home, and because this is still somewhat of an active matter, I'm going to be scant on the details. But I think there's a bit of a PSA element to this, and so as a result, I'm going to talk about something from current caseload. So this concerns OFSI in North Korea, the Office of the Financial Services Implementation in the UK, who've become concerned about the ability of North Korea to compromise tech businesses. And it's not just crypto businesses, but regular tech businesses, and particularly those that are based in the US and in the UK. So what's OFSI about? What's the regime? Why does it matter? So OFSI's been one of these agencies that was set up post-Brexit, and the sanctions regime across the EU, which the UK still sort of inherited and has changed since, really stepped up in 2006 when it comes to North Korea, after North Korea tested nuclear weapons. And North Korea has been effectively involved in a whole host of tech-related scams, if you like, or areas of operation. It's been involved in ransomware, so the notorious Lazarus gang, who have done all sorts of heists on US corporations, on African banks, etc., with the purpose of raising money to fund the weapons program. And then more recently, we've seen infiltration into Western companies, and that's oftentimes been to extract secrets. But then more recently, they've worked out that it can be used to extract money. And I don't know whether this was inspiration, but I like the story in the information security community of a guy who during lockdown had 3 jobs. He worked for 3 different IT security businesses. He was only found out when there was a big conference and two of his employers asked him to man the stand. And then one of them sort of recognized him and said, "Why are you there wearing their T-shirt? Don't you work for us?" And he said it was pretty easy, that working from home was quite a doddle. And if you're an assiduous guy, you could easily hold down 3 jobs. The allegation is that some of these North Korean IT workers hold down many jobs, and it's a good source of revenue for them, obviously, because Western wages are higher than those in North Korea. So at the start of this year, well, springtime, OFSI introduced revised guidance on North Korean workers. And effectively, they were interested in infiltration, where people apply for regular jobs at tech companies or other companies and as home working type positions. They're worried about this thing of swapping. So oftentimes the original candidate for interview will appear as a regular individual. That might be somebody from South America, for example, but then they will swap a North Korean in once the checks have been through for employment and once the interview schedules have happened. And then the other thing that OFSI are particularly worried about is that some corporations, how do we not deal with North Korea measures, are limited to blocking North Korean IP addresses. But that's never a good solution. Firstly, North Korea doesn't have that many nodes into the network, so a Korean IP address is pretty rare. Secondly, we know from way back that gangs like the Lazarus Gang actually operate probably from mainland China. So there are Koreans in barracks in China operating heists like the Lazarus heists. And thirdly, because more recently we've seen the use of Russian IP addresses, including, it is thought, some people close to the North Korean regime literally plugging in to a Russian server and running a fiber optic cable across the border and plugging the other end into a North Korean data center. So what are the signs, if you're a compliance person? What should you be telling your HR team to look out for? What should you be telling your recruiters to look out for? Well, again, the OFSI guidance is pretty good. It's pretty well written. It's pretty detailed. Happy to send a copy to anybody who wants it. First of all, obviously, people apply for jobs through regular portals. They apply via LinkedIn, and they may pretend to be from different places, even from Nashville. They might work multiple jobs. They might refuse to appear on camera or not be very spontaneous. So you might arrange a job interview and they say, "Yeah, my laptop's broken," or say, "I'm going to need to reschedule because I've got to pick the dog up from the vets," or whatever type of excuse that might be. Why they're doing that is because they need the sort of stool pigeon. They need to book that stool pigeon to sit in on the interview if you insist on them coming on camera instead. Their LinkedIn profiles can, you can spot some signs of that, at least at the moment, until they get better, probably using AI. So that qualifications might sound too good to be true. In the one that we're looking at, a relatively entry-level position attracted somebody who claimed to be a Harvard graduate, for example. They might have big-name prior employers using people like Google to add credit to the resume. They might claim to have worked for somebody in locale in a hybrid or remote role before to credentialize the application. They might have few connections. From those I've seen, they've got no posts at all, because obviously that's more effort to embellish the LinkedIn profile. And then you might be able to do text stuff to work out whether the person is real and who they say they are. You could do stuff like looking for multiple logins, because some of the North Korean workers seem to do that. You can look out for things like working hours, use of VPN, exfiltration of data. But again, some of that is hard because some of these North Korean threat actors, it seems, run little server farms where you give somebody a corporate laptop it goes to an old lady who puts it on an IKEA shelf in the corner of her living room with the other 20 laptops that are there, all feeding back and being controlled remotely by the North Korean threat actors. So what are the consequences of this? Well, firstly, data breach. Secondly, exfiltration of trade secrets. Thirdly, potential money laundering if you're sending money to North Korea, whether you intend it or not. Obviously, if you're a UK-based business or a UK subsidiary is involved since September 1st, you've got difficulties under the Failure to Prevent Fraud rules. You might have issues with labour law, with right to work legislation, etc. But the really interesting thing, I think, from my point of view, is OFSI are getting involved because they said they're going to use sanctions to discipline this. And they've said that the possibilities are civil and criminal. Whether you intended to or not, you're dealing with North Korea. You're dealing with a state that you should not deal with. And OFSI have said they will not require demonstrable knowledge to prosecute. They won't. They won't. Effectively, they're operating on a pretty low threshold, and the criminal offences could include up to 7 years jail time. Now, the good news is that isn't a North Korean jail, but that's still going to be pretty consequential for some people. So how do you prevent it? Well, obviously, I think as compliance professionals, you need to knock on the door of your head of HR, ask them what they're doing about this risk. And if the answer is nothing, that ain't a good sign. So you'll need, if you're outsourcing recruitment, you'll need to look at recruiters as well. You'll obviously need to do more due diligence on candidates. That's going to include checking their LinkedIn profiles, reverse image searches, all of that good stuff. My recommendation would be that you don't leave that to the recruitment team. Why not? Firstly, because a lot of them are incentivized on the number of, we call it in the UK, bums on seats. So the number of people they recruit. So that monetary incentivization may hit against good compliance. Secondly, because you may face allegations that somebody was discriminated against in a position because of the background research that was done on them. So let's say your LinkedIn research finds a candidate that isn't North Korean, that's perfectly great, but then the hiring manager says, yeah, but they have got small kids. I can see that from LinkedIn. They're not for me. So I would say you need two separate teams, somebody different's doing the background check versus the one making the hiring decision or influencing that hiring decision. Obviously do video interviews, obviously make them more spontaneous. Be aware of, the cat got my webcam type excuses at short notice. And obviously, if the person's giving you references or prior occupation, you've got to check them up. And the OFSI guidance seems to suggest that if you don't do that, then there might be sanctions consequences as a result. So I know it's not our usual topic and a bit off the wall, but as something that we're currently dealing with, just as an FYI, I've a guy who normally helps me with intelligence on a particular threat actor. He's somebody well connected with a good background. He sort of knew the issue and laid me down some practical steps. And I said to him, yeah, you seem to be really familiar with this risk. And he said, you're about the 200th inquiry I've had in the last couple of weeks from people who've accidentally employed North Korean workers. So it is a big thing, and you need to beef up your compliance program to deal with it.
All right. A risk that I'm sure the U.S. government will take up as well. Ladies and gentlemen, now we're on to shout outs and rants. Matt has a hard stop in a few moments, so we're going to let him go first. And here will be the order: Matt Kelly, Karen Moore, Karen Woody, Jonathan Marks, Jonathan Armstrong, and Tom Fox. So, Matt Kelly, what you got for us today?
So today I have a shout out to a politician here in Boston named Josh Kraft, who was one of several candidates running to be mayor of Boston against incumbent Mayor Michelle Wu. And last Tuesday, they had the preliminary election for that race for mayor. And the top two candidates, Mayor Wu would definitely be one. And then the top two candidates would go on to face each other in November. Well, Josh Kraft was the second place finisher there. However, Mayor Wu clobbered him by a margin of like 75% to 22% with a couple of other kooks in the tiny single digits. So Josh Kraft then did something astonishing in the modern American political landscape, and he realized he should just bow out because nobody was taking him seriously. That was a classy thing to do. It did not help Josh Kraft that he is not actually much of a politician. He is a novice politician trying to buy his way into office. B, he is a billionaire. He is the son of Robert Kraft, owner of the New England Patriots, younger brother to Jonathan Kraft, who runs the Patriots. And of course, the Kraft family is closely associated with Donald Trump because Bob Kraft is one of Donald Trump's close longtime friends. You can imagine how that would go over in a place like Boston. So yeah, Kraft got creamed by Michelle Wu, and then he said, what am I doing here? There's no lane for him to go forward. He didn't raise any complaints about stealing the vote or anything like that. He just understood voters didn't like what he was selling. He was only going to be throwing bad money after worse money. So he decided to drop out. Mayor Wu will now presumably be reelected in a huge landslide. That's what the people want. And Kraft was a class act to see it. So good for him that he had the common sense just to treat democracy the way it should be, with respect. And he got out of the way when it was time for him to go.
Karen Moore.
Well, I'm going to rant very, very briefly about Disney and ABC's decision to cancel Jimmy Kimmel or suspend his ability to broadcast after a very kind of not that funny, but also not that harmful remark about MAGA the other night. It's just, one more drop in the ocean of what's going on with media. Trump the other day on Air Force One spoke to reporters and said he thinks that the FCC should be revoking licenses left, right, and center because of the bad publicity that they give him, Donald Trump. When a reporter yesterday asked Donald Trump how he planned to characterize Antifa as a terrorist organization, given that it's a movement, not an organization, his response was, so is Antifa funding NPR. We're just seeing attacks that are, they're so unbelievable that they're kind of hard to credit. So that's my rant. I dread to see what's next, but slowly but surely we're kind of eroding the ability of media to say what they think, even in jest. So that's where we are. Watch the space.
Professor Woody.
Yeah, I have a shout out this episode, mostly because there's just too much to rant at, and we're all just sort of screaming into the wind. So I will have a shout out, and I'll have another sort of pop culture shout out, and that is to the win, actually landslide wins that the show Adolescent was able to pull in this weekend or Sunday night at the Emmys. It's just a fantastic show. It is hard. There's a lot of tough topics. But the star, who was 13-year-old, I think 14 maybe at some points when he's filming, won also Best Actor. So he's just now 15. But beyond that, I mean, the show is all single track. There are 4 episodes and it's just one shot. So even just artistically, it's spectacular to watch. But the substance also is really powerful and really kind of taking on some necessary issues of our time, certainly around teens and social media and all of it. So shout out to them and to the incredible work that show was.
Mr. Marks, what do you have for us today?
Yeah, I wanted to give a shout out to Chanel Jones on, I believe she's on NBC, and the fact that, her husband lost a battle, I believe, brain cancer not too long ago. And she came back like a trooper. But, I know it's really hard, but ancillary to that, I want to give a shout out to anyone out there who's a caregiver, to anybody going through cancer or battling that on a regular and ongoing basis. I think a lot of times people just don't understand how much stress and strain that's put on that caregiver. So, shout out to her. She's come back with vengeance. And I'm sure over time it won't be easy. It's never easy, but I give her a lot of credit, and all the organizations out there that help support the caregivers, like the cancer support community. A shout out to you as well. So thanks for that.
Mr. Armstrong.
Well, times two to Jonathan's. On a more upbeat note, it's my first visit to Nashville, and I grew up with something of a hatred of country music. I'm going to say it really quietly in case there's a mob outside, but I am going to recover. And that came largely because I worked a night shift in a warehouse to pay my way through college during the summer with a Kenny Rogers fan who would only allow Kenny Rogers to be played in the warehouse. But, dear listener, Mary, Shirley and I went to the Grand Ole Opry on Wednesday night. And I'm going to shout out to the Grand Ole Opry. It's a phenomenal experience. I even was able to sit through and sing along to The Gambler, sung by Don Schlitz, one of the co-authors. It's the 100th anniversary of the Grand Ole Opry, so I want to wish them a great 100th birthday. And so good was the experience on Wednesday night that, dear listener, have a guess where I am for my last night in Nashville tonight.
Did you take the tour and stand on the circle?
I did not. I did not feel worthy just yet.
Well, you need to take the tour so you can stand on the circle. I'm going to give a shout out to the Community Foundation of the Hill Country, headed by Austin Dixon. At 9:43 a.m. on Friday, July 4th, they opened a fund for victims of the Kerrville flood. Within the first 3 days, they had taken in more money than the foundation had ever taken in. Within the first 30 days, they took in $100 million, setting the all-time record for donations for a natural disaster in the United States. In that same time frame, they had given out $11 million, which was also the highest number of grants ever made from such a tragedy. For the first 7 days, they received a donation online every 0.5 seconds. It was the giving for the victims of the flood in the Texas Hill Country was beyond describable. Thank you to everyone who donated, and shout out to Austin Dixon and his team at the Community Foundation of the Hill Country for their work in helping us get through this tragedy. Well, ladies and gentlemen, what an episode. I think we're going to have to keep this kind of 3-week schedule. Everyone's very serious when they come back on. I can't wait to see what we come up with next time. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.